Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name's Professor Coretta Phillips, and I'm the head of Department of Social Policy, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to this event that the Department of Social Policy. I want to extend a huge and very warm welcome to all of you, those that are joining in person and also online. This is the third in our series of annual lectures where we invite eminent speakers. Sorry, I'm aware of some feedback. Are you getting that here? Is that just me? No? Okay. I'll keep going. So our annual lecture series is where we invite eminent speakers to join us, eminent thinkers in the field of international social and public policy. Before I say a bit more about our speaker, I just have a few, as ever, housekeeping matters to attend to. So in the event of a fire alarm, the fire assembly point is opposite this building on the corner of Lincoln's Inn Fields. For those ex-users, the hashtag for today's event is hashtag LSE Social Policy. We are recording the event and it will be put up as a podcast, assuming that there are no technical difficulties. Please, can I ask you to put your mobile phones on silent so you avoid disrupting the event. I also want to thank colleagues that have been important in ensuring that this event happens and have put lots of work into organising this event. First and foremost, Dr. Robtel Nijay Paley, a member of faculty in the Department of Social Policy. Also our brilliant events manager, Maria Schlegel, and also our colleague, Pippa Agar, and also the stewards who are ensuring our security this evening. Thank you to everybody for that. By way of introduction, Professor Patricia Daley, welcome, thank you, is Professor of the Human Geography of Africa and Helen Morag Fellow in Geography at Jesus College, the University of Oxford. Her intersectional research combines a foci on the vexed issues of our time, both kind of from a political, personal and intellectual perspective. Professor Daley works at the intersections and is interested in complex questions of forced migration, identity politics, and citizenship. She is also personally and professionally situated within feminist praxis framed by geopolitics and the geographies of racialisation and coloniality. And her research on political ecology explores the relationship between conservation, resource extraction, and rural livelihoods. Professor Daley is a recipient of several prestigious awards. I'm just going to mention two of those. Professor Daley is a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and an honorary, and has also been awarded an honorary fellowship of the Royal Geographical Society. The last accolade that I'd like to mention is one that's perhaps less prestigious than it should be, and that's that Professor Daley is the co-founder of Oxford University's Black and Minority Ethnic Staff Network. And these staff networks provide a safe space for those of us that work within university settings that where racism is present in many forms and at many levels. Professor Daley's talk this evening is entitled Reconceptualising African Migrations Towards Decolonial Futures. She'll be talking for around 45 minutes, so we should be finishing the presentation around 7:20, and then hopefully there should be 30 minutes or so for questions. So thanks, Professor Daley, over to you.
Hey. Right, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you this evening to offer some reflections on my work pertaining to decolonizing asylum and rehumanizing African migrations. I am recovering from the flu, so if my voice goes or I sound a bit weak, please bear with me. I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers, in particular Dr. Rob Paley and Professor Stephen Jenkins for the invitation to speak. And obviously Professor Coretta Williams for chairing this evening, and Maria Siegel, who's been amazing in terms of facilitating my presence, particularly when I wasn't replying to emails and other things. So thank you, Maria, for bearing with me. I must admit that as a geographer, I was rather reluctant to accept this invitation to speak to social policy experts. I've always been keen that geographers engage with policy. And in 2019, in my role as sort of director of undergraduate studies, I initiated, but did not, and have not taught, a module entitled Geography and Policy. Moreover, by positioning myself as a decolonial scholar, I've been highly critical of the disciplinary silos to which academia confines scholars. In my research and teaching, I have drawn widely from a multidisciplinary group of Black and African scholars for theories, empirical evidence, and inspiration. And more recently, I've become interested in the literature on policy development, in particular policy mobility and implementation and how they might relate to refugee policy in the continent of Africa. So before I begin my talk, and in the spirit of comradeship and collegiality, much of this talk is based on conversations and collaborative work with former students, research assistants, and colleagues in Oxford and Tanzania. Hannah Brankamp, Mwanza Kamata, Leio Singo, Hashim Abushama, and notably Dr. Amber Murray, who's my colleague at Oxford, and with whom I have been involved with many sort of co-publishing ventures. The title of my lecture today is Reconceptualizing African Migration. And I've been a scholar of forced migration of Africans moving primarily from Burundi to Tanzania. My mission now, I think, is to challenge and dismiss the premise that the migration of Africans is necessarily a problem. This is an important claim to make, especially in the context of rising xenophobia on parts of the continent and the anti-immigrant, anti-Blackness that we found in Europe and other areas of the global north. From the time of my doctoral research 4 decades ago, I've been interested in the development of refugee law, policy, and practices in post-colonial Africa. Then, of interest was in the 1980s was the global adoption of the 1951 UN Refugee Convention and its 1967 protocol, and the regional legislation such as the 1969 Organization of African Unity Refugee Convention. And also, of course, individual African states as they became independent and were confronted by people labeled by the international community as refugees, were encouraged to develop their own national refugee laws and policies. In my early work, I explored colonial legacies and the role of the international community, mainly the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and its numerous implementing agencies, in shaping refugee law and policies of post-colonial African states. The prevailing assumption then was that Western humanitarianism could teach Africans how to treat strangers benevolently and how to identify and classify them within a modern post-colonial state. Fast forward to the 21st century. According to the Missing Migrant Project, since 2014, an estimated 29,671 desperate people have died or are missing in the Mediterranean due to barriers to their mobility erected by the European Union. In light of these avoidable deaths and the rise of European Union border externalization policies that contradict international refugee law, and those of us in Britain might be familiar with that, the now abandoned Rwanda plan, another externalization policy. These policies have forced many into slavery or premature deaths in North African countries. So in light of this approach and these attitudes in the global North, can we accept that, can we still or continue to accept that global North countries as arbiters of what constitutes human rights and as exemplars of policies and practice in relation to refugees? Clearly, the answer is no. In the last 10 years, a growing body of critical scholarship has shown how racism has been fundamental and remains central to Europe's contemporary migration policies. The UK Home Office's own report on the historical roots of the Windrush scandal documents the centrality of racism to UK migration legislation and policies. The hostile environment was always present. If race was so central to Western policymaking on migration, how have those policies traveled and have been adopted in global South countries? Should we be much more concerned about the insidious effects of global North racist and dehumanizing externalization policies in the global South and their impact on mobility, not just out of Africa, but also within Africa and other global South countries? In some, the treatment of refugees and migrants at the US, UK, and EU borders signify that the international community can no longer claim to provide the blueprint and expertise for humanizing regional and national refugee legislation and policy in Africa and elsewhere in the global South. Western opposition to African mobility and human rights is given clarification also in the emerging literature on the colonial legacies of international migration and humanitarian regimes. Edwin Odiambo Obuya, Ulrike Kraus, Luce Maiblim, and others have demonstrated the colonial and racialized roots of the 1951 Refugee Convention, its biases, and at the time of its negotiation, the struggle by anti-colonial and independent countries to make the convention global. Left to the then colonial powers, the convention was supposed to only apply to European refugees. The then colonial states, plus the USA, Canada, and Australia, were, according to Odiambo Obuya, highly resistant in private, if not in public, to the institutionalization of a regime which might extend rights to all human beings, irrespective of their country of origin or the color of their skin. So from the very start, humanitarian regimes deployed the epistemic power of Western social science expertise to set the post-colonial agenda, defining the category of the refugee and delineating their associated rights and spatialities within newly independent states, thus limiting the capacity of African states to think of asylum for Black others beyond a Eurocentric conceptualization that placed constraints on African people's mobility. The reliance on external funding to support refugees led to the pursuance of policies conducive to donors, with punitive state actions against Africans who move, such as the closure of borders, camps, rounding up of refugees in towns and villages, becoming bargaining tools in resource negotiations and allocations. Geographers have written extensively on policy mobility, diffusion, and transfers, and have increasingly called for an interdisciplinary focus to research on policy mobilities. Drawing on Tom Baker and Christina Temenos' argument that policy mobility can be understood as being part of a socio-material assemblage, I seek to understand how refugee policies in East Africa have emerged out of a complex assemblage of colonial and international laws. Also out of the universalization of Western concepts of modernity and the nation state, international and local discourses about migration, colonial histories and logics of migration management, funding sources and mechanisms, and national and local political competition. In particular, I'm interested in how these external flows intersect with African concepts of political community and belonging, such as Pan-Africanism and Ubuntu. In practice, refugee policy mobility occurs through a myriad of pathways, conferences, UN and EU funded projects, political statements and decrees, consultancies and media reports, academic books and articles, and rumors. Policy mobility is also interscalar and context dependent. And I'll be talking about the Tanzanian context later. Academic research plays a role in refugee policy transfers. Most research on Africans fleeing state-sponsored violence or civil wars begin with the application of international categories of asylum seekers, refugees, internally displaced peoples, and they verify concepts such as the nation state, borders, and humanitarianism. Research questions tend to reflect the concerns and solutions preferred by the UN or the international community. Here, I'm reminded of Claude Ake, the Nigerian political scientist, who states that the very fact that we define something as a problem, we take for granted that it is a social problem. African mobilities were not problems until they were presented as social political problems. Ake has shown in this text, which I'd encourage you to read, how social science, in particular Western social science, has colonized those in the global South to accept scientific knowledge as signifying methodological rigor to which they should all comply. The African-American geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore defines racism as the ordinary means through which dehumanization achieves ideological normality, while at the same time, the practice of dehumanizing people produces racial categories. This culture, she says, in turn, is based on the modern secular state's dependence on classification, combined with militarism as a means through which classification maintains coherence. The legal scholar, Itende Achumi, reminds us that contemporary national border regimes of the international order are normatively racial constructs. Race is used, she argues, to enforce inclusion and exclusion. Thinking decolonially, the social anthropologist Budawakshe Vanyoro recently writes that we should abandon essential terms such as border and migrant. This means that any purported solution must be imagined outside of these juristic and academic conceptions. As a decolonial Pan-African scholar, I've been encouraged by the emerging literature on abolition, especially that of border and camp abolition, that challenges and seeks to dismantle the dehumanizing systems of border and refugee management, primarily in the global north, and the racial logics within which it is embedded. The issues of a borderless Africa and freedom of movement have been central to debates and conceptualization of post-colonial Africa. These human-centered ways of treating Africans who move have been largely circumvented by the West's Cold War and war on terror, securitization policies, and concepts of national sovereignty. The project of decolonizing borders and African migration entails a double movement: undoing and dismantling colonial spatialities and ways of being in the modern state, while simultaneously building new liberated ones infused with solidarities and contributing to movements for reparative justice and healing that address and redress intergenerational harms perpetrated in the name of modern humanitarianism. In this, I note that the border abolition movement and the decolonizing asylum movement drew from and were inspired by the prison abolition movement and Ruth Wilson Gilmore's work on abolition geographies, which assert the need for the negation of confinements, borders, structures, and relations of carceral geographies to end the prison industrial complex. Abolitionist perspectives can be directed generatively towards the migration architecture, especially that of the humanitarian regime governing forced migrants. For me, upending the elaborate systems of the international migration regime begins with the dismantling of our understanding of the extant system as a normative way of addressing fundamental political problems, voluntary and forced displacement of people, and the premise of seeing migration of human beings as a problem per se. My recent book with Amber Murray, Learning Disobedience, Decolonizing Development Studies, arose from co-teaching in the School of Geography and the Environment at Oxford. It was written for our students with an interdisciplinary focus and start with the premise that we need to abolish development studies and reimagine human sociality starting in the global south. This perspective equally applies to migration studies and policies. This evening, I take as my starting point the imperative for collective projects to decolonize African migrations. Just such projects to start from where one is located. And for me, that involves starting in the academy with the curriculum and with the research we do. Part of this struggle means defining the philosophies and this set of principles that I've learned in the Eurocentric Academy in my fields of African studies, refugee studies, and geography. While we might have adopted the concept of epistemic disobedience from decolonial scholars, such as Walter Magnolia, decolonial thinking is rooted in my intellectual development outside the academy that has primarily been non-compliant, anti-racist, and directed at epistemic and social justice. I also recognize this is a process towards the construction of more decolonial futures. As an African Jamaican British feminist scholar, I come from an intellectual tradition rooted in African people's everyday existence. My own defiance owes much to my maternal grandmother and aunts, phenomenal women who've worked as housewives, caterers, nursing assistants, peasant farmers, and domestic workers. The women in my family survived where they were not meant to even thrive, created belongings in marginal spaces, and ensured a sense of belonging that transcended generations. They made family life, laughed, clapped, prayed, sang, and danced by creating life worlds on the margins of Western societies. My intellectual flowering occurred outside the academy, and from reading Pan-Africanist women writers, poets, and artists such as Maya Angelou, Dion Brand, Grace Nichols, Loretta Nkobu, Bell Hooks, and Ife Amadume, all of whom possessed heightened awareness of injustices and intersecting oppressions. These African theoreticians, working largely outside the Western canon, were unafraid of disrupting, constantly creating new concepts and vocabularies to express the specificities of their condition, to articulate their resistance and to communicate their imaginations of a better future. They recognized that the very existence of Black African people and their futures are dependent on the production of themselves as independent, critical thinking beings who are able to analyze their condition, and in the words of Thomas Sankara, dare to invent the future, to create a world otherwise, beyond the colonial formulations that have been bequeathed to them as part of Western civilizational discourse and praxis. So while unlearning and divesting from the knowledges within which I have been trained, in the words of the Guyanese scholar Walter Rodney, I seek to occupy the terrain so as to free the whole structure, not join and reproduce it. My socio-historical thinking on Africa has been informed by the works of Pan-Africanist scholars such as Walter Rodney, Horace Campbell, Patricia McFadden, as well as Mahmoud Mamdani and Francis Nyomja. In particular, their explanations of how colonial boundary making and territorialization, racial, ethnic, and gendered construction of human beings on the continent contribute to the violence underpinning contemporary state-society relations. Militarism, genocidal and patriarchal violence, and xenophobia are the outcomes in the adoption and reproduction of colonial ideologies, categorizations, and logics as normative pathways to modernity without questioning their relevance to African empirical realities. So in our article, Defiant Scholarship, Dismantling Coloniality in Contemporary African Geographies, Amber Murray and I critique some of the colonial logics that persist in contemporary studies of African geographies. And I think these could apply to other subjects areas as well. We know that colonial persistence is revealed in the historical foundations of the university in African countries, including the political pressures of positivist study within neo-imperialist contexts, in which socioeconomic domination often occurs through the deliberate weakening of sovereignty. We know that colonial persistence exists in the ways in which Africans adopt particular bodies of thought, international legislation, policies, and practices as symbols of progress, without considering their relevance or desirability in the African social context. We note colonial persistence is revealed in how Africa is situated in other bodies of thought, include the silences and erasures of the functioning of racialization in scholarship and African societies within and beyond human geography. We know that colonial persistence is revealed in how Africa is represented as a space not for theory making, only as a space of description, a problem to be solved by humanitarians and development experts. And finally, we know that colonial persistence is revealed by attempts by white Africanist scholars to disconnect the concerns of Africans in the diaspora from those of Africans on the continent, ignoring histories of intellectual and political solidarities and the relationalities of experience. So beginning with the refusal to take coloniality, whiteness, and its hierarchies and privileges as a matter of fact, and to take Africa's impoverishment and Black marginalization for granted as a feature of contemporary life, being in the world, and academic knowledge making, we have committed ourselves to the task of repair, reimagining, and transformation beyond it. Drawing on Paulo Freire in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, the mission of radical pedagogy is rehumanization. And that is only possible, he says, because dehumanization is a concrete historical fact. It's not a given destiny, but the result of an unjust order that engenders violence in the oppressors, which in turn dehumanize the oppressed. Social and epistemic justice have been central to my research on forced migration, militarism, and humanitarianism in Africa. Researching on the experience of Burundians who fled the 1972 genocide and took refuge in Tanzania has forced me to ask, how have post-colonial states become complicit in racist and dehumanizing practices. In 2000, my 2008 monograph, Gender and Genocide in Burundi, addressing the 1972 genocide that led to the displacement of Burundians, I explored the continued significance of colonial racialization, the role of militarism and race thinking in the formation of the modern African nation state, the social construction and maintenance of racial and ethnic hierarchies and boundaries first by the Germans and then the Belgians, and how they enabled the continuation of processes of economic extraction in the post-colonial period. I coined the term the genocidal state to define social formations where the politics of exploitation, exclusivism, race, eugenics, militarism, extremism, and patriarchy come together in a society where the politics of competition means the elimination of the other and results in acts of genocide, war, and embedded militarism. And I think we can identify some genocidal states in the present. Histories of genocidal logics and violence point to the persistence of a racist militarist state that fails to see its people as human. What Patricia McFadden terms plunder as statecraft produces colonial spatialities. Even with ethnic majority rule, for example, Burundi's leaders see the majority of their population as surplus to their ability to participate in global extraction regimes and therefore expendable. So back to Tanzania, and my research there. Since the 1960s, Tanzania has garnered praise for its open door policies on refugees. Most refugees within Tanzania have come from neighboring countries. Rwanda, Burundi, and the Congo. And they have been settled mainly in this area. This was an area of refuge historically, where people fleeing, kingdoms or war would settle. It was also a very fluid area during the colonial and pre-colonial period. But obviously, the institution of the borders and attempts, successive attempts to secure the borders has left this, made it very impossible for people to move without being detected. Tanzania, in fact, has hosted large groups of refugees from Mozambique, Rwanda, Democratic Burundi, and Democratic Republic of Congo. And in December 2023, the UN estimated that about 240,000 refugees and asylum seekers were in Tanzania. My own research, though, has focused on that 1972 cohort of Burundian refugees living in these three settlements here, Katumba, Mishamo, and Ulyankulu. And they've subsequent refugees who have fled after 1972 have not been placed in what we call agricultural settlements. They've been encamped, largely in camps that have been, sorry, I'm going forward rather than backward. How do I do that? Yeah, largely in camps that are in this area here along the Burundi-Rwandan border. And they've experienced successive displacements, including forced repatriation, followed by further displacement. And the thesis produced by Yolanda Weimar, looking at the multiple displacements that refugees and Burundians have, in Tanzania, moving back and forth, moving to the Congo, then back to Burundi, and so on. And she argues in her thesis that enduring the violence of successive displacements and land dispossession and associated impoverishment means that the international humanitarian solutions of return and reintegration are severely flawed and inhumane. She's arguing that the policies really don't address the reality that people are experiencing, particularly those Burundians who are displaced. In Tanzania, my research forced me to question taken for granted concepts that serve to dehumanize generations of people whose lifeways, identities, and very existence was subjected to labeling, relabeling by the UN agencies, whose experience reflected colonial continuities, even in Tanzania, the most benevolent state. So Africans fleeing the violent legacies of colonial rule and continued processes of extraction, moving often to kinfolks on the other side of a colonial border, have been corralled into camps, justified as enabling humanitarian expediency, never gaining their full rights under international law. In Tanzania, this was possible because national legislation post-independence was virtually a colonial hangover. The 1965 Refugee Control Act was a revised version of the colonial 1948 War Refugees Control and Expulsion Ordinance, a colonial security instrument aimed at restricting mobility and prohibiting political activities. Security concerns have remained at the heart of later refugee policies, such as the 1998 Tanzanians Refugee Act. And that was informed by prevailing international laws and policies of refugee management. So my analysis of Tanzanian refugee policy reveals two competing approaches towards African people labeled as refugees. First, a Pan-Africanist approach that embraced them as kin, as belonging, and the second, a colonial Eurocentric modernist approach that construct forced migrants as surplus population, unwanted and with disposable life. The first, the more radical and humanizing approach, was expressed in an open door policy, a tribute to Tanzania's first post-colonial president, Julius Nyerere, and his political philosophy that drew on the principles of Ubuntu, an African way of being and living with others, and the Pan-African ideology of the collective liberation of African peoples wherever they are. Nyerere's humanism was counter to that of the international community of the time. He demonstrated solidarity with anti-colonial liberation movements and also the anti-apartheid movement. And in Tanzania, he promoted a popular discourse that positioned refugees as wageni, the Kiswahili word for guest. Wageni were welcomed with African hospitality. The sociologist Jimmy Adesina contends that Pan-Africanists such as Julius Nyerere and Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah were grounded materially in norms of mutuality and convivial hospitality, features that they saw as definitive of most pre-colonial African societies. In its contemporary form, their objective was to ground the new societies they sought to build in a cluster of humanitarian principles which underlie traditional African society. And Adesina quotes a Swahili proverb, which some of you might be familiar with, which is Ngeni siku mbili, siku ya tatu mpejembe. So you're a guest for first 2 days, and on the third day, you're given a whole, right? And he argues that that Nyerere thought that given the shared social norm, that the guest would not wait to be given the whole, he or she would ask for it. Adesina also notes that there were a range of social policies, both in Tanzania and in Ghana, that were directed at promoting inclusion and national solidarity. So in 2007, Nyereism, which I would call Nyere's Ubuntu, or some people call it African socialism, I argue, may have influenced the Tanzanian government's decision to naturalize that 1972 cohort of Burundian refugees. That's 162,000 plus people, right? And they'd been in the country for 45 years. So it's quite a significant period. The whole process took over 10 years. And there's still, according to the UN, about 18,000 people who are still of that cohort who still have refugee status, many awaiting the outcome of their citizen application. The digitization of refugee status verification and later naturalization provided an opportunity for the state to monitor more effectively the Burundian settlements and allowed easy data sharing to facilitate the global North anti-terrorist, anti-South-North migration agenda. Tanzanian scholars Wanza Kamauta, Leyo Singer, and I have argued that becoming a citizen in Tanzania lessened but did not remove the unbelonging, otherness, and pervasive insecurity experienced by these Burundians. Their status in Tanzania remained contingent and shaped by enduring coloniality, security concerns, and an emerging discourse of Tanzanian national exclusivism. With freedom of movement in and out of the settlements still restricted, Tanzania has created a second-class group of citizens. So now the second approach to fleeing violence was shaped by the global security concerns of Cold War geopolitics and the destabilization of the region by the racist apartheid state in South Africa. Tanzania's need for security coincided with the donors seeking to prevent rebels gaining communist support. Consequently, Burundian refugees had to be apolitical, silenced, and geographically contained in settlements, often justified, as I said earlier, by arguments of humanitarian expediency. Concepts such as burden sharing and durable solutions were promoted and deployed to justify international intervention. Consistent with international othering of refugees, periodically, Tanzanian politicians expressed opposition to refugee presence in their territory, accusing them of criminal and subversive activities. And this opposition to refugees intensified during the 1990s with the introduction of multi-party politics and political competition. And I think what's interesting also was some of the bureaucrats drew on sort of Burundi's genocidal histories and assumed that the former refugees and former citizens had genocidal attributes. They assumed that these were embedded into innate and intergenerational. And this actually intensified after the 1994 genocide committed by Hutus against Tutsis in Rwanda. Public perception of Burundian Hutus in Tanzania shifted from being victims to that of violent people, in contrast to Tanzanians who exemplified peace and stability. Not surprising then, the term refugee became stigmatized and the new citizens hid their former identities. Some even later applied officially to change their ethnic status, their ethnic name to Higwa, a Kirundi term meaning lucky people. This was refused as status officials viewed ethnic identity as immutable. The naturalized Burundians, the new Tanzanian citizens, continued to face threats, insecurities, and threat of displacement. There was, in 2011, there was an attempt to clear the settlements to set up large-scale biofuel plantations. I'm moving fast. In 2009, UNHCR erected a monument in Katumba settlement commemorating the generosity of the Tanzanian state in granting citizenship. And yes, compared to its neighbors, Tanzania should be lauded. However, in 2021, UNHCR admitted that attempts at integration of the 1972 refugees had failed, and the state was focused purely on the repatriation of later cohorts of Burundian refugees. So more recently, refugees in Tanzania face restrictions that prevent them from work, trade, and attend school. Such policies have echoes in what is happening in the global north and begs the question, are these policies flowing from the north to the south? Do they reinforce local activities or are they purely locally derived? I'm looking at time. Okay, I think I started late, so I tried to finish. Sorry?
5 minutes.
Okay. Okay, so in interpreting the plight of Burundian in Tanzania, I argue that humanitarian interventions delegitimize the forms of effective relations, such as neighborliness and the expressions of conviviality and solidarity, as in Ubuntu. These could not be easily monitorized, as in budget allocations, and were considered not illustrative or exemplar of a modern state and its relationship with outsiders. So humanitarian interventions drew on colonial logics of colonial controlling natives as a security problem. Practices of forced relocations and expulsions and encampments were used to silence and punish anti-colonial native activists. Humanitarian architectures of containment, which include camps, gated compounds, fences, and barbed wires, IDs, fingerprinting, and permits, are artifacts inherited from the colonial way of instilling terror. And here I draw on the work of Achille Mbembe, who talks about how to live under modern occupation is to experience a permanent condition of being in pain, fortified structures, military posts, and roadblocks. This is what many of the refugees live on in the context of Tanzania. Hannah Branken and I wrote that control over people's mobility was also a technique of labor mobilization. And in this article, we trace the continuities between colonial labor migration policies and contemporary refugee control policies in Tanzania. And we argue that in some laws governing migration between states and the categorization of those who moved according to the cause or purpose of their migration, either as labor, economic migrants, aliens, refugees, visitors, irregulars, and more recently internally displaced peoples and protected refugee communities, are international bureaucratic instruments that sustain ideas of racial otherness. And I think we are conversant with the notion that race and ethnic groups are social constructs, and there's considerable research that has been done in Africa to show how those racial and ethnic hierarchies were developed and affect political participation and differential experiences of people within African states. And it is really, I think it's instructive to remind ourselves that of Aimé Césaire's exposition on racism in Discourses on Colonialism, where he writes that colonization leads to dehumanization and thingification by turning colonized people into objects. Looking at the time, okay. So one of the things I have been interested in is promoting a humanizing agenda, I think, at the heart of my scholarship. In my teaching and my research, and we've been attentive to the dominant silence on race and racism in migration studies and refugee studies. We have drawn on the work of Uma Kotari and others who have written about white humanitarianism, who defines both the other and the problem and imagines the humanitarian self as the only solution to to problems in the global South. We recognize the importance of anti-racist study of humanitarianism, particularly one critical of whiteness and examining the structures of racial privileges and power in humanitarian studies and practice. And a chapter that I have in the book, Amidst the Debris, Humanitarianism at the End of the Global Order, in that I challenge the white supremacy embedded in hegemonic understandings of humanitarianism and what it means to be human and to live dignified lives in the world. As an academic seeking to decolonize my scholarship on African migration, I asked, how can we actively introduce into our work ethical consideration? And I draw on the Decolonial Charter of Decolonial Research Ethics, articulated by Decolonial Europa, where they challenge academic researchers to divest themselves of the authority that is embedded in their positions as a researcher and the expert through geopolitical location. In an article in the journal Refuge, I outlined what decolonial ethics might look like and asked, how might we do research that do no harm? I just want to finish by just referring to how a humanizing decolonial approach could draw inspiration from historical moments of emancipatory practices by African states. So it is not basically newly independent African states were able to take a principled stance against colonial and white domination on the continent in the 1960s. They allowed the immigration of those fleeing colonial rule and provided sanctuary to liberation movements from apartheid state. They established the Organization of African Unity Liberation Committee, which had its regional office in Dar es Salaam. So it is possible, we can argue, that there are alternatives to ways of providing support for refugees. This is an example of a progressive stance towards refugee communities. And before the border abolition movement, if we look back in history, we can find that oppressed communities that were forged beyond and against Eurocentric social order through processes of resistance. Some of you will be familiar with emerging literature on marriage, autonomous Black communities in the Americas beyond societies of enslaved people. There's also the Pan-Africanist vision of African unity that emphasizes a common humanity in opposition to colonial cartographies and racial and ethnic divides. Sorry. So whilst border abolition then is a long-term Pan-Africanist ambition, meantime, we have to think more in terms of the eliminating of border and policies and practice that serve to dehumanize and restrict the freedom of movement of African peoples. African countries have reproduced restrictive laws on African mobility and have adopted global North policies on war and terror and border externalization, many funded by Western governments and international development institutions. They're still difficult for Africans to move throughout the continent. African mobility is restricted. Visas are, it is incredibly difficult for Africans to travel visa-free. A study by the African Development Bank stated that only 26% of countries in Africa, Africans could travel to without requiring visas. So obviously intercontinental African mobility policies of the African Union, various regional economic unions, and supported by the International Labour Office, whilst using the language of freedom of movement, reproduces colonial logics on labor migration and are still based on MSS's notion of the thinnification of the African as an instrument of production. Is it a challenge of decolonial scholars to study migration that humanizes Africans? And okay, so in order, I'm moving towards close. I think there's considerable literature which talks about the ways in which Africans live transnational and plural lives as part of their everyday, as part of everyday practices in communities that are supposed to be divided by colonial boundaries. And Francis Nyamja asks us to challenge epistemic frames that represent citizenship, national identity, the nation state as given and complete projects. He argues that in Africa, they are problematic hegemonic projects that force the lived realities of Africans into conceptual frames that generate processes of exclusion and dehumanization and contribute to both state and personal insecurities. And the last slide. So in conclusion, uprooting the deeply embedded Eurocentric systems of knowledge in Africa begins where we are located, epistemically within our disciplinary and subdisciplinary areas of focus. I invite you to participate in an active divestment in the hegemonies of knowing and practice fostered by our colonial academics, actors, sectors, funding, and epistemes. This freeing up of our labor, energy, and political resources allows us to direct more attention to repair, repatriation, justice, and decolonial options. A reconceptualization of African migration requires a decentering of security arguments that reproduce colonial logics of population control and subjugation and result in exceptional levels of suffering. Decolonial thinking involves reducing the emphasis on aid, donor funding, and Western expertise on migration management that perpetuates the dehumanization of Africans. Instead, decolonial thinking revives ontologies and epistemologies that accepts multiplicity of mobilities and spatialities. It explores the flexibilities, socialities, and convivialities that exist in and between African communities. The limited but inspiring examples of state-sponsored Pan-African solidarity exemplifies the possibility of disrupting and transcending the racist national territorial focus of European concepts of belonging to one that is humanizing, plural, transnational, inclusive, and reflects African lived realities and future desires. Thank you.